In this episode, we begin with a simple but powerful idea. If you cannot explain why a security choice makes sense for your environment, you are relying on hope rather than control. Targeted risk analyses exist to replace vague confidence with structured reasoning, especially when a requirement allows you to choose how often you do something or how you tune a security activity. New learners sometimes think risk analysis is only for executives or auditors, but the real purpose is much more practical. It helps you make consistent decisions and defend them when someone asks why you picked that approach. In the payment card industry, PCI, world, those decisions affect how you protect cardholder data, how you prove your protections work, and how you keep the cardholder data environment, CDE, from quietly becoming less secure over time. When you learn to perform targeted risk analyses well, you stop treating security as a set of random rules and start treating it as a set of choices guided by threats, evidence, and real outcomes. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A targeted risk analysis is not a huge, company-wide project that tries to measure every risk in the universe, and that is exactly why it is useful. It is a focused evaluation of a specific decision point, usually tied to a specific control activity, where the question is not whether security matters, but what level of effort, frequency, or rigor is appropriate. Instead of asking what are all the risks to the organization, you ask what risks apply to this activity in this environment, and what could happen if we do it too rarely, too loosely, or without the right coverage. Because it is targeted, it should be tightly connected to an actual security requirement and an actual system boundary, rather than being a generic brainstorming session. The key outcome is a decision that is backed by reasoning, such as choosing a monitoring interval, a review cadence, a validation frequency, or a method for detecting certain threats. When done well, it produces a clear explanation that links threats and impact to a specific control choice that you can carry forward consistently. This topic matters in PCI because modern standards increasingly recognize that environments differ, and a fixed rule can either be too weak for one organization or unnecessarily heavy for another. The standard still expects strong security outcomes, but it also expects you to show how your choices support those outcomes in your particular context. That is where targeted risk analyses come in, because they provide the bridge between the requirement and your real environment, including your data flows, your network boundaries, your service provider relationships, and your operational practices. For beginners, it helps to think of the analysis as the story of why this control activity, at this frequency, with this scope, is the right fit to protect the CDE. Without that story, you might still be doing something that looks reasonable, but you will struggle to defend it under assessment or to adjust it intelligently when things change. A targeted risk analysis is therefore both a decision tool and a stability tool, keeping your security posture from being driven by habits or guesswork. To perform these analyses in a way that drives decisions, you need a crisp understanding of what risk means in this context. Risk is the combination of something bad happening and the impact if it does happen. But in targeted work, you care even more about the path that makes the bad thing possible. That path might involve how an attacker could reach the CDE, how a misconfiguration could expose data, or how a missed alert could allow an incident to grow. When you evaluate a decision point, you ask what could go wrong if the control activity is weaker than it should be, and what could go wrong if it is stronger than necessary, such as creating operational fatigue that causes people to ignore important signals. You also ask how likely those outcomes are given the environment's exposure, complexity, and change rate. Beginners sometimes treat likelihood as a guess, but you can ground it in concrete factors like how often systems change, how many people have privileged access, how much remote connectivity exists, and how much external exposure the environment has. The more you anchor your reasoning in observable realities, the more your decision becomes defensible rather than opinion-based. A very practical teaching point is that targeted risk analyses usually show up when you must choose a frequency, because frequency determines how quickly you notice and respond to problems. If you review logs often, you can detect suspicious activity sooner, which reduces the time an attacker has to move deeper into the environment. If you validate segmentation regularly, you reduce the chance that a quiet change opened a new pathway into the CDE. If you scan for vulnerabilities frequently enough, you reduce the window where known weaknesses can be exploited, especially when attackers move quickly after new flaws become public. The decision is not simply more is always better, because excessive frequency can create noise, cost, and fatigue that undermines effectiveness. A targeted risk analysis helps you choose a cadence that is aggressive enough to manage the threat, but realistic enough that the organization will actually sustain it. The result should be a choice you can explain, like why weekly is appropriate here, while quarterly might be too slow, or why daily is necessary for one activity, but not for another. The next step is learning a simple, repeatable method that prevents the analysis from becoming a vague discussion. A beginner-friendly method starts with defining the decision you must make, including what the options are and what the control activity affects. Then you define the assets and outcomes you are protecting, such as cardholder data, system integrity, transaction availability, and the trust boundary around the CDE. After that, you identify threats and failure modes tied to that decision, such as attacker movement through a misconfigured rule, malicious changes by a compromised admin account, or missed detection due to delayed review. Then you consider exposure and likelihood drivers, like internet-facing components, remote access, reliance on service providers, or rapid deployment cycles that increase change frequency. Finally, you consider impact in terms of what could realistically happen, not just in theory, and you choose an option that balances detection speed, operational capacity, and security need. The most important part is that the method produces a decision you can repeat and refine, not a one-time essay that nobody can use. When you identify threats for a targeted analysis, you should think in terms of plausible stories rather than abstract labels, because stories reveal the specific weaknesses the control must address. For example, imagine a scenario where a non-CDE workstation is compromised through phishing and then tries to reach the CDE through an unexpected network path. In that case, the decision about how often you validate segmentation is directly tied to how quickly you would detect that the path exists and how quickly you would close it. Another story might involve a newly discovered vulnerability in a web component that touches the payment flow, where the choice of scanning and patch evaluation cadence changes the attack window. A third story might involve a service provider's remote support access being misused, where the decision about access review frequency and monitoring affects how quickly misuse is noticed. You do not need dramatic storytelling to do this well. You need clarity about paths, boundaries, and how control timing influences outcomes. Once you can describe the threat path in a few sentences, you can explain why a certain control cadence is necessary rather than arbitrary. A targeted risk analysis should also consider how the environment behaves during normal operations, because ordinary change is often the biggest driver of risk over time. Environments that change frequently, such as those with regular software releases, infrastructure updates, or dynamic scaling, tend to create more chances for misconfigurations and unexpected exposures. Environments that rely heavily on shared services, like centralized identity or shared logging platforms, can create single points where a mistake affects many systems. Environments with many administrators, many vendors, or many remote access pathways increase the number of potential entry points and the complexity of oversight. None of these factors automatically mean the environment is unsafe, but they influence how quickly something can go wrong and how quickly you must detect it. This is why targeted risk analysis is so useful. It forces you to acknowledge the real operating conditions that should shape your decision. A cadence that fits a stable environment may be dangerously slow in a fast-changing one, and the analysis is where you explain that difference. It is equally important to think about the quality of detection and response when evaluating frequency, because frequency without effectiveness can become a false sense of security. If you choose a daily review but the signals are so noisy that reviewers cannot find real issues, the practical detection time may still be long. If you choose frequent scanning but do not have a process for acting on critical findings, the vulnerability window does not shrink in a meaningful way. Targeted risk analysis should therefore include questions about operational capability. Who will perform the activity? How will they know what matters? And what happens after they find a problem? Beginners sometimes assume that choosing a stronger frequency is automatically safer, but if the organization cannot sustain it, the activity becomes performative and may even distract from more effective controls. A defensible decision is one that the organization can execute reliably, because reliable execution is what actually reduces risk. When your analysis connects frequency to both detection time and response capability, it drives a decision that is realistic and protective. Another key piece of decision-driving analysis is making sure you define the scope of the activity itself, not just how often it happens. For example, if you say you validate segmentation, you must know which boundaries and pathways are included, because validating only a subset can miss the very gap an attacker would use. If you say you review access, you must define which privileged accounts, service provider accounts, and administrative paths are included, because leaving out a category can create a hidden seam into the CDE. If you say you review logs, you must define which log sources matter most to the payment flow and the CDE boundary, because reviewing the wrong logs thoroughly is still missing the point. A targeted risk analysis should justify not only the cadence but the coverage, because coverage determines whether the activity can detect the threats you identified. Beginners often focus on cadence because it feels measurable, but coverage is what ties the activity to the real risk path. When cadence and coverage are both justified, your decision becomes robust instead of fragile. A common beginner misunderstanding is treating targeted risk analysis as a way to justify doing less, as if the goal is to negotiate security downward. In healthy use, the analysis can justify doing less only when the environment genuinely has lower exposure, stronger compensating factors, or architectural choices that reduce risk, such as keeping the primary account number, PAN, out of most systems through tokenization. In many environments, targeted analysis actually justifies doing more, because the real risk path is shorter than people want to admit, or because change is frequent enough that slow validation creates long windows of exposure. The value is not in the direction of the decision. It is in making the decision grounded and defensible. Another misunderstanding is thinking the analysis is only for compliance paperwork, but in practice it should produce operational clarity that teams can follow without constant debate. When it is done well, it prevents future arguments because the reasoning is documented and tied to real conditions. That is why this tool is powerful for both exam success and real-world discipline. Documentation is a necessary part of targeted risk analyses, but beginners should think of documentation as a communication tool that preserves the decision logic, not as a performance for auditors. Good documentation states the decision, explains the key risk drivers that influenced it, describes the threats and impacts considered, and records why alternative options were rejected. It also records assumptions, because assumptions are the parts that become wrong when the environment changes, such as assuming limited remote access or assuming a stable change rate. The document should also identify what would trigger a revisit, like major architectural changes, new external exposures, or a shift in incident history. This is how targeted analysis stays alive rather than fossilized, because you can return later and update it when conditions change. For exam thinking, it is useful to remember that assessors are looking for coherence and evidence. The analysis should match the environment description, the data flow map, and the control operation reality. When these pieces align, the decision becomes easy to defend. Targeted risk analyses also connect tightly to shared responsibility and service providers, because decisions about monitoring and validation often cross boundaries. If a provider operates part of the payment system or provides logging and monitoring services, you need clarity about who performs which activities and how you confirm they are performed. If a provider controls network components that influence segmentation, your validation approach must account for their role, their change process, and the evidence you can obtain. If a provider's remote access is part of the administrative path into the CDE, then your access review and monitoring decisions must include that path, not just internal users. Beginners sometimes treat provider relationships as separate from risk analysis, but provider seams are often the highest impact risk drivers because they add complexity and reduce direct visibility. A targeted analysis that ignores provider seams is incomplete because it fails to evaluate a major part of the threat path. When you include provider responsibilities explicitly, your decision becomes more realistic and your governance becomes stronger. Finally, a targeted risk analysis should be designed to be revisited because the most dangerous risk decisions are the ones that never get updated after the environment evolves. New integrations can change data flows, new systems can create new connected-to relationships, and new access methods can introduce fresh pathways into the CDE. Threats also evolve, and the rate at which attackers exploit new vulnerabilities can change the required speed of detection and response. A mature approach treats targeted analyses as living decisions, reviewed when key assumptions change or when incidents reveal that detection is too slow. This does not mean constantly rewriting documents. It means having a disciplined habit of checking whether the decision still fits reality. When you do that, targeted risk analyses stop being paperwork and become a steering mechanism that keeps the environment aligned with its risk posture. That is the deeper purpose behind the requirement. Decisions should be intentional, evidenced, and resilient to change. By the end of this lesson, the key idea is that targeted risk analyses are how you turn flexible requirements into disciplined decisions that protect the CDE in a way you can defend. You focus on a specific decision point, identify the relevant threat paths and operational realities, and choose a cadence and coverage that actually reduces risk while remaining sustainable. You avoid the trap of treating the analysis as either a negotiation tool or a generic essay, and instead you treat it as a repeatable method that produces clarity and stability. You document the reasoning so it can be reviewed, challenged, and updated as the environment changes, and you include shared responsibility seams so the decision reflects the full payment ecosystem. When you can do this consistently, you demonstrate the kind of evidence-driven judgment that the internal security assessor, ISA, role is meant to represent, and you make security choices that are not just compliant on paper, but effective in reality.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.